Can China-U.S. relations be improved and stabilized? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. The China-U.S. relationship has taken some major hits in recent years, and there are serious questions about where it's headed. That has caused some prominent Americans to publish an open letter to U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping, calling on the leadership in both countries to work closely on stabilizing bilateral relations. The former U.S. Senator and Vice Presidential nominee Joe Lieberman is one of those who added his name to the letter. My colleague Mike Walter talked with him about that recently.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. You added your name to this open letter to U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping, encouraging the leaders to work together, quote, to repair and stabilize the state of affairs between our two countries. The letter is published on the website of the National Committee on United States-China Relations. It's also worth noting that former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Cohen and former ambassadors Gary Locke and Max Baucus also put their names on this letter. Why is it so important to try and get these two leaders to talk at this stage, do you believe?
Thanks for asking me on. I'm glad to talk about this topic. Look, to me, the most important bilateral relationship in the world today, certainly for the United States, is our relationship with China. It's true now, and it will be true for many years to come. And right now, the U.S.-China relationship is heading in a bad and really potentially destructive direction. We have to acknowledge that we want our relations with China to be better, and we want at least to make sure that whatever differences the U.S. and China have never develop into a military confrontation. We have China and the U.S. have different national interests at this stage of development, different values, but it's very important. But we also have a lot that ties us together. We have a history of cooperative and mutually beneficial relations. Unlike, for instance, our relations with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, where we had no really good history and no economic interrelationships, our economy and China's are just totally interwoven to the mutual benefit of both. And we don't want to lose that. So at a minimum, in that statement, this group I'm part of was appealing to Presidents Xi and Biden, please do what's good for both your countries, and at least begin discussions again, which will pick up on the positive note. Seems long ago that the two presidents struck when they met in Bali last fall.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned interwoven, this economic relationship, very important, but also strained, as we know. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen recently said that decoupling from China would be disastrous and destabilizing for the rest of the world. The IMF really backing up what she had to say, coming out with a report in April saying that tensions could disrupt overseas investment and eventually lead to a long-term loss of 2% of the world gross domestic product. When that comes to my checking account, 2% is not that big. But when you talk about the world gross domestic product, that's huge. Can you talk to us about this important element, which you mentioned? It's interwoven. We have a lot of business leaders in both countries who have a lot at stake here, who are very concerned.
Yeah, absolutely right. Look, I want to go back a little bit in my own career in Washington. During the 90s, my first full decade in the Senate, under President Clinton, with whom I was close, there was a major push to bring China into most favored nation trade status with us, but also into the World Trade Organization. And the idea was that that was the best way to benefit both economies and to bring China to a point where we didn't take many people out of poverty and into the middle class and beyond. We've got to acknowledge that in all the years since the 1990s, when we improved our relations, following really on the leadership of Deng Xiaoping and the people who followed him, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, our economies have been tied closer and closer together, again, to the great mutual benefit of both countries. I mean, the extraordinary rise of people out of poverty and to China and to the middle class and beyond. And here in the U.S., just the benefit to American companies investing in China, and also to American consumers who, as a result of our trade relations with China, were able to buy quality goods at lower prices than they otherwise would have. So there's a lot of griping, complaining on this side about China behaving unfairly with regard to intellectual property and trade generally. But the way to deal with that, it's a business dispute, is to sit down, talk to each other, negotiate, and work it out. We have to start talking to one another regularly again at the highest level. Our group has been involved, the group that made that statement has been involved in track 2 so-called discussions with former leaders of government in the People's Republic of China through the Chinese People's Institute of Foreign Affairs. We had a wonderful meeting last, I guess, December, maybe it was November. And we hope to go to Beijing for the next meeting sometime soon, hopefully over this summer. And we're just track 2, but each of us reports to our government after the discussions, and it's important for the 2 presidents and their top officials to not just meet once, but to have continuing dialogue, because they go back to what I said at the beginning. There's no relationship, I'll speak as an American, more important to the U.S. in the years ahead than our relationship with China. And I think it's a pretty important relationship for China as well.
Okay, now for reaction to former Senator Lieberman's comments, joining us from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is chair professor at Soochow University. With us too from Beijing is Zoon Ahmed Khan. She is a research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. And also joining the discussion is Saurabh Gupta. He is senior Asia Pacific policy specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. He's right here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to all of you to the show. Victor Gao, let me start with you. We just heard the former Senator, Joe Lieberman, describe the relationship between the United States and China as the most important relationship in the world. And of course, he's one of the signatories to that open letter, which calls for stabilizing relations. And he says this call comes at a time, in his words, a pivotal moment in global history. There are many others who've signed that letter, among them diplomats, former cabinet members have signed that letter as well. So what do you read into this at this time? How significant is this call?
Thank you very much for having me. I listened very carefully to what former Senator Lieberman had to say during the interview, as well as read very carefully the open letter signed by dozens of very distinguished, outstanding Americans, many of whom actually I've known for years, including Senator Lieberman, whom I met back in the United States. I think Senator Lieberman had a voice of rationality and also objectivity and decency when looking at the China-U.S. relations, which are indeed the most important bilateral relations, not only for our age, but for future generations to come. I think he analyzed the current situation of China and the United States also in great objectivity and sounded the reasons and the rationality for how to handle the differences between the 2 countries with the objective of producing a mutual benefit for both the Chinese people and the American people. Now, this is against the overall background of continuous deterioration of China-U.S. relations dropping to probably the lowest level in my memory, for example. And this is truly scary and frightening, not only to many people in China and the United States, but to mankind as a whole. Because if the deterioration of relations between China and the United States continues without moderation and management, both by Beijing and Washington, it may get out of control. And if war breaks out, as Senator Lieberman warned, it may really bring disaster not only for China and the United States, but for mankind as a whole. Therefore, I think we all need to listen very carefully to what Senator Lieberman had to say and read the open letter very carefully, both in Beijing and throughout China, as well as in Washington and throughout the United States, so that we will normalize our relations between China and the United States and put the bilateral relations back to track of more peaceful and manageable relations. And the differences between China and the United States, which are many and plenty, should be managed rather than being allowed to hijack the agenda and push our bilateral relations out of control.
Zoon Ahmed Khan, you know, as we heard, this is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, but it is also a relationship that is very closely watched by the rest of the world because the impact it has on security, on things like climate change. We know these two countries have in the past worked together to try to combat climate change, and of course, the impact that this relationship has on the global economy. These are the two biggest economies in the world. And Senator Lieberman makes the point that although China and the United States have their own respective national interests as well as their own sets of values, this should not preclude dialogue. I mean, how important is it for these two countries at this time when there are tensions for them to get together and improve dialogue?
Thank you, Anand, firstly, for having me on the program. And like Mr. Gao, I think I was also, firstly, I'll mention that, you know, when this letter was firstly published, right, like it was circulating in a very positive sense on WeChat groups. I saw a positive reaction to the fact that people as influential as Senator Lieberman and so many others have this rationality and positive sentiment towards cooperation in a climate that has indeed deteriorated. And I would also add here that the fact that it takes more courage for people like Senator Lieberman to talk about rationality, dialogue, and to move away from a zero-sum mindset in the United States already symbolizes a big difference in attitudes. In China, I think when we talk about major threats, of course, this is an absolutely important, the most important bilateral relationship, like all of you have emphasized. But at the same time, the challenges we face as humanity are climate change, economic challenges. You go to the global south and people want to address poverty, hunger, starvation. I mean, these are real critical challenges that have only worsened for developing countries, given the last 3 years of COVID-19 and also the Russia-Ukraine conflict has also, you know, it worsened the situation for many people across the world. So firstly, I would say that if you ask any individual in the developing world, especially, that what would you rather choose? Leadership of the US following the United States or having a hegemony, or dealing with poverty? Having a more stable climate, having the ability to use global technological cooperation to the advantage to address real practical challenges that humanity faces, everyone will choose the latter.
Right.
And I think here the point that both China and the US, China is doing an incredibly positive job at helping countries, developing countries, understand how to address issues, and has always said, we want dialogue, cooperation, conflict resolution. Look at the recent Saudi Arabia, Iran detente is an example as well. So it is vital for China and the US to cooperate on technology, on climate change, and focus on the global challenges, because this is what the world needs. This is what a vast majority of the world recognizes.
Saurabh, Zoon raises an important point there when she talks about the need to move away from the zero-sum mindset. And we did hear in that interview with former Senator Lieberman, he mentioned several times that there is a need to improve dialogue. There is a need for the two countries to talk, to get relations back on track because there are benefits for both countries.
Oh, absolutely. I think he was absolutely correct. And what I think Senator Lieberman was alluding to was that, we need to see the big picture and we need to get back to basics. In the course of all these little trade wars and technology wars and all the bitter rhetoric which has been going around, it is framing a new narrative which is taking us away from the reality in which we exist today. And the reality is that these are the two biggest economies and among the most powerful players in the world, and problems in the world will not be solved without the two countries having some sort of a meeting of minds. So, and I think he was absolutely correct in that regard. It's also very encouraging to see people who have had very senior positions in the U.S. government, even if they once they've stepped out of the U.S. government, willing to champion this relationship. Because the problem in Washington is that there is so much groupthink out here that people who are within government don't have the courage to step and hold an original opinion on this or a contrarian opinion on this front. And that's how the groupthink gets entrenched. And that's why we need very senior players who've been there, seen it, done that, and talking reality to all of us that this is the way it should be done, because the two countries are fated to collaborate if this world is to move into a better place.
And Saurabh, we look at some of the signatories on this letter, among them former ambassadors Max Baucus and Gary Locke. The former defense secretary in the Clinton administration, William Cohen, also signed this. If we listen to what is being said here in Washington about this relationship, President Biden says he's not looking for a confrontation with China, but he has said he will not allow China to overtake the United States. So do you get the sense that there is a will here to get relations on a more level playing field?
The point that you raised just now is a really good one, because not just President Biden, others also have been framing this in terms of number one and number two, and we will not let number two come ahead of number one. And that is creating, unfortunately, this narrative where number one and number two actually need to sit together and work together, and only then will a lot of the problems in global society be solved. Now, the Biden administration is right in defining this as the most consequential relationship. The problem has been in its first 2 years, it took a very negative approach to the relationship. And while it is now trying to reverse that, since the Bali meeting, the US side has talked in terms of open lines of engagement, communication, et cetera, but there's just so much mistrust even today as to just what exactly the US wants. For example, we have 2 weeks back, Secretary Yellen reaching a hand out to China. 1 week thereafter, we have National Security Advisor Sullivan essentially slapping China. And so really, even on the economic front, what is your message? I think there's mixed messaging happening here. And China's wondering, where are these guys going? What is the intention, even if they do want to engage us? And I think that element of trust is severely lacking, and it's holding everything back, frankly.
Victor, as we've heard, this is an incredibly important economic and trade relationship. These are the two biggest economies. As Senator Lieberman said, it's the most important bilateral relationship in the world. One of the complaints we've heard very often here in the United States is the concerns that the Americans have over intellectual property. Senator Lieberman answered that question, and he said this should be considered a business dispute that is open to negotiation. But, what do you make of that? How much of a radical change would there have to be in terms of mindsets for this relationship to move in a more positive direction?
First of all, I hope the American friends and everyone else in the rest of the world will need to bear in mind that in China's rapid economic and political reform, there was actually no legal recognition of property rights in China up to the early 1980s. And then the existence of the intellectual property right also started from scratch, from zero, and evolved into what we have right now. By today, China already produces more intellectual property rights, like patents and copyrights, you name it, than any other countries in the world. So nobody should pretend to believe that China had intellectual property rights or even property rights before China started the economic and political reform back at the end of the 1970s. Therefore, we need to adopt this dynamic view about China, about how the property rights or the intellectual property rights evolved in China, and how China scaled new heights again and again. And by today, China is not only a champion of protection of intellectual property rights, but a producer, the largest producer of intellectual property rights of all kinds. Therefore, people in the United States and elsewhere in the world should not only have patience about China, but also confidence about China of doing the right thing. I do believe that China will be the most important protector and promoter of intellectual property rights of all kinds, not only for the Chinese intellectual property rights, but also for intellectual property rights produced in the United States and anywhere else in the world, because this is not only the right thing to do, this is also in the fundamental interest of the Chinese people and people everywhere in the world. Therefore, don't be seized with the fact that maybe there are indeed defects or imperfections in the protection of intellectual property rights in China 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, or, for example, when there was no recognition of intellectual property rights at all in China, or even no recognition of property rights to start with. This is the rapid transformation of China. And don't be surprised with the rapidity and the profoundness and the scale and the magnitude of all these changes in China. And we need to be really confident about the right things that China has been doing and will need to do in the future for the benefit of not only China, but for mankind as a whole. I'm very confident about the correctness, about the roadmap and the pathway of development and reform that we are engaged in China.
Zoon, something that we should remember is that it wasn't always like this, as former Senator Lieberman pointed out. He said there used to be a time when the relationship was very good, it was mutually beneficial, and it's not a new relationship. I would imagine that officials from China and the United States talk to each other on a daily basis, even now. But yeah, how are they going to make that step, take that leap to build confidence and to get back to that time that Senator Lieberman talks about?
I think I'll start with saying that, you know, he mentioned that even though China and the US have different systems, different values, even different perspectives, honestly speaking, they have had a history of cooperation. And I think any person who is studying or observing international relations will know that differences in perspectives have not been a reason to refuse to cooperate with a country. I think one of the things is that, yes, economically, and we see that, you know, studying the Cold War and today the China-U.S. dynamic, the economic cooperation has been a significant aspect, and the interdependence is something that is absolutely undeniable. And it was all possible with different systems, perspectives, values, so to speak, just different standpoints, right? But I think the real problem, the elephant in the room, if not the mammoth in the room, is that at this point, and for a few years now, for the US, the priority is to stay number one. And China is the only country currently that can become number one. So this mindset is the biggest barrier that is not allowing people sitting in DC who don't have the courage or even the perspective to think more rationality from actually engaging with honest dialogue, with real open-mindedness. And you see that they say, okay, right now all of the American media is saying, oh, China is not talking to us. I mean, right, post the balloon incident, they're not. But the point is, there is a lack of transparency and also a lack of genuine regard and desire to cooperate with China without trying to curtail or curb China's development or engagement with the world. So if I have to give me 30 seconds, yeah, what is a way to engage? More people like the ones who have authored this letter and published it, yeah, need to come together and need to make policymakers in Washington realize, right, this is good for the US to cooperate. it is important to think about the pragmatic needs of the world. It is good for the US economy and American people as well. I think that needs to be done. Dialogue is everything.
Okay, Saurabh, clearly there are challenges, but if we look at what's going on right now, the Biden administration has doubled down on those trade restrictions that were initially introduced by the Trump administration. And we've, at the same time, heard, different opinions. We've heard a very senior official in the Biden administration, Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, warn that any attempt at decoupling the economies of these two countries would end in disaster. So is there any kind of pressure coming from the US business community to improve the relationship?
Yes, I think US business is asking for a much more improved relationship, especially, China is going to grow at 6% plus this year probably, and China has got many, many good years of growth. I mean, China is it's an $18 trillion economy, yes, but it's just a $12,000 per capita economy. It is going to get to 36,000 at some point of time. You're going to have an economy which is going to look like 50 trillion, and you want to have a piece of it. The problem, I think, right now out here is that, as I talked about, mixed messages coming out. A mixed message, number one, is from Janet Yellen herself. Last year, she was talking friendshoring exactly at this time. And today now she's saying, no, we don't want decoupling. The world is big enough for two of us. And she should have been saying that last year. But on top of that, it's good to see constructive approach from her, especially with the debt ceiling crisis looming out here.
Yeah.
But the point is, there is still legislation in the works with regard to trying to ban TikTok, or giving the Commerce Secretary authority to essentially ban TikTok out here. Yeah. And TikTok is interesting considering that this talk of IP. China came down and said TikTok's algorithm is not open to purchase. Okay. That's China's IP, and so we need little clarity. I mean, there's an investment screening mechanism which will come. So I think those mixed messages are just not aiding the U.S.-China relations economically.
Yeah, and we are going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thank you to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Have a great weekend.